For about as long as video games have existed, a certain question has plagued the medium. It is a question that should, by all accounts, be very easy to answer, and yet it has persisted for decades. That question is, of course, are games art? Perhaps the most notable discussion surrounding this question comes from Roger Ebert's article, "Video Games Can Never Be Art." Though this article is not his earliest such claim, it is the most complete argument he makes on the matter. In the article, Ebert makes the case that because games are goal-oriented, they fundamentally differ from other forms of art. Whereas a film, song, or painting can only be experienced, games can be beaten. They can be won. This, in Ebert's mind, disqualifies video games from consideration as an art form entirely. It removes the authorial intent from the work, throws the curated experiences of other art forms out the window entirely. He compares video games to games like chess and mahjong, claiming that the players of these games have never tried to compare their pastimes to a painting in a museum. Ebert then concludes by implying that the video game industry is consumed with commercialization, and that gamers are obsessed with defending themselves. Obviously, I take issue with Ebert's essay. I fundamentally disagree with much of what he has to say on the matter. Many games are, at their core, curated experiences. Take Sandfall Interactive's smash hit Clair Obscur Expedition 33. While playstyles and party members can be customized, the story beats and general progression of the game are completely fixed. The player has no say in what happens, save for their choice of ending, of course. If anything, the fact that the player directly interfaces with a story they ultimately have no control over increases that story's emotional impact. Games like Expedition 33 are, to be reductionist, essentially really long movies that can be enjoyed and absorbed over multiple weeks. In this regard, at least, they are certainly art, despite Ebert's claims to the contrary. Some games even take things a step further and directly integrate their gameplay into the narrative experience to improve their impact. Take, for example, Remedy Entertainment's Alan Wake 2, a game that I somehow keep coming back to on this channel. Here, the gameplay is more than just a way to get from point A to point B so a story can be experienced. It is instead a key part of the story itself. In Alan Wake 2, you jump between two protagonists, author Alan Wake and FBI agent Saga Anderson. Both stories can be experienced in whichever order the player wishes, and this makes it so that one player's experience with the game might be entirely different from another's. Each protagonist also has a mechanic that really enhances the integration between story and gameplay. Saga has the Mind Place, a room in which the player can examine case files and draw connections between pieces of evidence to progress. Alan, meanwhile, has the Writer's Room, which allows him to literally rewrite reality around himself, to alter events and solve puzzles. In this way, Alan Wake 2 presents a unique fusion of form and theme in a way that no movie or book can, and it is therefore exactly the kind of experience that disproves Roger Ebert's argument. This sort of game is more than just storytelling with a controller. It's an example of the player as the co-author of meaning. In this way, games are not only equivalent to other forms of art as far as emotional experiences, but I would argue they have the capacity to surpass other art forms and deliver truly unique stories and emotions. However, I must concede that Roger Ebert brings up some completely valid points. I find myself especially moved by his claim that the industry suffers from over-commercialization. For every Expedition 33, every Alan Wake 2, every game with true passion baked into it, there are a dozen games I would semi-affectionately call sports slop or gun slop. Your Maddens, your Call of Duties, you know the kind of game I'm talking about. Can we really call games art universally when a game series that is fundamentally the same each iteration prints money year after year? I don't think so. There has to be some sort of distinction made, some line drawn in the sand, but it can be difficult to figure out what counts as art and what doesn't when it comes to games. The distinction between art and consumer product is murky at best. So, to that end, I want to first determine just what it is that makes something art. Then, using that, we can figure out just when it is that a game really becomes art. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the definition of art is one of the biggest debates in human history. Philosophers and critics alike have tried to nail down a solid definition for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks saw art as something that was done with one's hands. They even had a word for it, techne. In the Middle Ages, art became something almost divine, something that brought us closer to the Christian God. Then the Enlightenment came along and declared that art was the pursuit of beauty. In the past century or so, the term art itself has seemingly come under fire. Take, for example, Marcel Duchamp's fountain, which is nothing more than a urinal signed R. Mutt. Or go listen to 4 minutes 33 seconds, a song composed by John Cage in which no instrument is played at all. These pieces are not perceived as art in any previous context. One would be trash, the other would certainly never be performed. Yet, in the modern context, they can be seen as art through the lens of intention. Fountain brought the question of what is art to the forefront of the art world and was eventually accepted as art for that very reason. 4 minutes 33 seconds forces the audience to confront the impossibility of absolute silence. Even when no instrument plays, the listener is still surrounded by noise. In doing this, Cage brings attention to those sounds we would normally take for granted. Both of these seemingly meaningless pieces are, in fact, powerful art. We can, perhaps, extrapolate this to the medium of video games. Again, I'm not here to argue that Madden 25 is high art. However, I think what many people fail to consider is that not every game is Madden. There's this generalization that seems to happen with games more than any other artistic medium, this idea that all games exist solely to kill time, that they cannot be art because they are, at the end of the day, consumer products. But here's the thing about art. It's really up to interpretation. The most important aspect of an art piece is arguably not the intent of the artist, and not the perspective of the observer, but some combination of the two. The tricky thing about this, as far as games are concerned, is that they are unlike any other medium. The observer takes a far more direct role in the consumption of art than they do when they look at a painting or watch a movie. Whereas these other forms of art are representative, games are interactive. They are, for lack of a better term, living systems of player input. Again, not all games fit these criteria. Some games, like The Last of Us, are semi-sarcastically notorious for essentially being movies rather than interactive experiences. But even The Last of Us allows for far more direct input than any movie ever has or likely will. This unique merger between narrative and mechanics, developer intent and player choice, means that games deserve to be critically examined under an artistic lens. So, if we accept that some games can be art, the next question is, of course, which ones? Because it's not enough to say that games can be art and just leave it at that. That would be like me saying words can be poetry and just leaving it there. Yeah, that's technically true, but that doesn't mean the instruction manual for my IKEA end table is a great work of art. Words, like any other art form, have to meet certain criteria to be considered poetry. There has to be intent behind the words, a certain style, something evocative enough to stick with the reader long after they've finished reading. I would argue that a similar set of criteria exists for games to be considered art. First, as with poetry, a game should be intentional with what it wants you to take away from it. This is where many games fall short for me. Take, for example, the entirety of the military shooter genre. You're thrown into a war zone where you are inexplicably tougher than your enemies. You mow down countless soldiers on the path to saving the day and being a hero. It's a power fantasy, one that is mostly unexamined from an ethical standpoint. You, as the player, are really just there to feel powerful for a while and then turn the game off and go about your life. As a quick aside, the footage I'm using here, the multiplayer reveal trailer for 2019's Call of Duty Modern Warfare, has this as one of its top comments currently. They better put a nuke at the end. And sure enough. It really makes me wonder how we got to this point, where one of the worst atrocities ever committed by mankind has become a source of dopamine for a group so addicted to the act of killing in games that they are completely desensitized to the real-life mass murders that used this very weapon. But, of course, I digress. Because as abhorrent as the military shooter genre is, there is one very notable exception. And that exception is Spec Ops: The Line.
Can't shake this guy, Walker! Hit the brakes and keep her steady! trust me!
Jaeger Development's 2012 game starts out like any other early 2010s cover shooter. You take out the evil terrorists in the Middle East with a crew of rugged American Delta Force operatives. Standard stuff, really. As the game progresses, though, things start to take a turn. Your actions become increasingly unjustifiable, and the game makes this known. Even its loading screens change over time from generic shooter tips like, "A dying enemy won't drop his weapon until he's dead," to more pointed comments such as, "The US military does not condone the killing of unarmed combatants, but this isn't real, so why should you care?" And, "Do you feel like a hero yet?" My personal favorite is, "Cognitive dissonance is an uncomfortable feeling caused by holding two conflicting ideas simultaneously." This is, of course, commenting on the player's choice to continue playing the game despite their belief in the immorality of killing civilians. The culmination of this cognitive dissonance is arguably the infamous white phosphorus scene, in which the player kills countless civilians by unethical and illegal means. Anyone who plays beyond this point must either refuse to acknowledge these actions as morally reprehensible, or they just don't feel bad enough to turn the game off because those deaths weren't real. The game tries its hardest to point out that you are no hero, you are a criminal. That is intentionality. Spec Ops has a very clear message, one that is impossible to ignore. This is where it distinguishes itself from its peers in the generic US military shooter genre, and it's why I would argue that Spec Ops is art when very few shooters are otherwise. If a game is concerned with more than just letting you win and feel good about yourself, that is a very good sign that it might be considered art. The second hurdle a game must clear to be considered art is something I would call aesthetic integration. This doesn't just mean that the game looks or sounds good. Those things are nice, of course, but that does not inherently make a game art. Instead, I believe that a game is artistic when all of its components, visuals, sound design, narrative, etc., come together to deliver a single cohesive experience. My personal favorite example of this is 2019's Disco Elysium. From the onset, it's clear that this is no ordinary detective game. You, as Harry Dubois, need to reconstruct yourself from nothing. Everything in the game reinforces this narrative. The game's skill trees are inner monologues. The art style is best described as a decaying oil painting. The soundtrack sounds like a memory on the verge of collapse. Every choice you make informs Harry's identity, determines who he is and what he believes. Another excellent example of aesthetic integration is Outer Wilds. The exploration, the music, the core Deathloop mechanic itself supplements the game's core thesis of finding meaning in spite of transience. With every loop, every dramatic orchestral crescendo, you learn a little more, and that knowledge stays with you as you begin again. In both of these games, nothing feels ornamental. Every element feeds into the same emotional current. They're more than games that contain a story. They're stories told through systems and sensation. When a game achieves that level of integration, it stops feeling like a product and begins to feel different. It feels almost like a dream that you had once and want to revisit again and again. And when something makes you feel that way, I would argue it has artistic merit. Finally, for a game to be art, it must have transformative capabilities. It should leave you changed somehow. To me, art is about imprint, not impact. Or to put it another way, it's not about how loud a game can shout, but how well its whispers stay with you after you're done. In a literal sense, NieR Replicant does this better than just about any other game out there. It starts out as a deceptively tropey fantasy game in which you play as a boy named NieR trying to save his sister Yona from a disease. The story is good, if a bit generic. The combat is fine, but nothing exceptional. The music is, of course, otherworldly, but that says more about the composer than the game itself. This facade of normality keeps going right up until you beat the game. For the first time, anyway. See, NieR Replicant doesn't stop after the credits roll. It asks you to return and replay your journey with one small change. You can understand the enemies now. What once sounded like generic monster noises become pleas for help and cries for long-lost loved ones. Every creature you've killed was once human. They had a name, they had a family. They grieve for themselves and for those they've lost. To them, you are the monster. The game doesn't shame you after this revelation. It doesn't tell you you're in the wrong. All it does is add context you were missing the first time around, and it lets you sit with it for a while. The result of this is a slow collapse of moral certainty. The player no longer believes themselves to be the good guy. Much like in Spec Ops The Line, they are left with a sinking feeling and an uncomfortable weight in their chest. Do you feel like a hero yet? NieR Replicant concludes by asking the player to delete their save file to save an NPC's life. This is a permanent deletion, unless you're playing the remaster, which adds a new ending that I personally am not very fond of. There's no way to recover your save file. This is the end. When you delete all traces of your existence on the hard drive, all that remains is the memory of your journey. For this reason, I think Replicant has stuck with me more than most of the games I've played. I also haven't gone back to replay it as I do with so many other games I love. It just doesn't feel right. That world is gone. That story is finished. That sensation, that palpable feeling of loss is a transformation that occurred within me as a result of playing a game. I have been irrevocably changed by NieR Replicant and many other games, and I think that is the truest indicator of art there is. Here's the uncomfortable part of the video, because if only some games are art, then by necessity, some are not. And it's tempting to tiptoe around that, to say, well, everything's art if you squint hard enough. And however well-meaning that sentiment might be, it's dangerous. It flattens the term art until it means everything, and at that point, art means nothing. Some games simply are not art. This does not mean that they are bad, to be clear. But art requires intention, it requires expression, it requires something more than just being concerned with retention, and I think this is where some games really miss the mark. Games like Call of Duty, Destiny 2, or League of Legends are fundamentally not art. They don't care about lasting impressions or moving their players, they're products to be bought and returned to again and again. New seasons, new battle passes, new skins, new hooks. These systems are psychologically addictive by design. This is not meant as an insult, it's simply a different design philosophy. These games don't pretend to be art either, they don't need to be. But it's at least worth being honest about the distinction. And here's where things get messy. People can have meaningful and memorable experiences within these games. You can meet lifelong friends in MMOs, you can hold on to the memory of a particularly hard-fought victory in a shooter. These experiences are real, of course, they do matter. It's important to recognize, however, that the meaning generated by these instances is external. It is projected onto the game, not embedded within it. It's natural to want to believe that our experiences matter the most, that our time invested means that the game must be meaningful. That statement is true, I think. That time we spend in games is inherently meaningful. Meaning, however, is not the same as artistry. Art is more than what we feel, it's what was designed to be felt. It's important not to fall into elitism here. Not all games have to be capital A art, that's not at all the point I'm trying to make here. One game being more artistic doesn't inherently make it better than another that is less so. Sometimes distraction and dopamine are exactly what we need, and that's perfectly valid. The problem doesn't lie in the fact that some games are products, the problem arises when we forget that's what they are. When we confuse output with expression, flashy designs for emotional depth, pure aesthetic for meaningful art, we dilute the meaning of the word itself. It's also important to keep in mind this doesn't mean all games made by big companies are inherently bad or creatively bankrupt. More on that later. We need to judge games on their own merit, not by the size of the development team. So no, not all games are art. Some are engineered for engagement, some are crafted for monetization, some are just frictionless experiences with nothing deeper behind them, and that's okay. If nothing else, I would hope that the fact I've been using Destiny 2 footage for this section should showcase that. I enjoy the game, I genuinely do, but I do not think it is art. If we want to honor the games that are art, we have to be willing to say, gently but clearly, that some games just aren't trying to say anything. They simply exist as is, products to be enjoyed. Doing so is the only way we can really appreciate those games that set themselves apart from the rest. With this framework in mind, it's easy to assume that only indie games can be art, that if a game is backed by a AAA studio, it must be corporate, soulless, safe. But that's not always true. Take, for example, Final Fantasy XIV. On paper, Final Fantasy XIV is a product, a never-ending franchise. In reality, though, there's a lot more to it than that. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 debuted in 2010 to less than universal acclaim. It was borderline unplayable, it sold horribly, and it was seemingly destined for failure. Square Enix responded to the awful state of affairs by quite literally destroying the world, sending the moon Dalamud hurtling into the land of Eorzea, which culminated in the shutdown of all the game's servers. They turned their failure into a part of the narrative, launching Final Fantasy XIV 2.0 under the name A Realm Reborn, taking place after the cataclysmic impact. I cannot overstate how cool this concept is to me. Instead of being discouraged by commercial failure, the team at Square Enix wove that travesty into the tapestry of their overarching story, turning what would otherwise be a frankly pathetic attempt at saving face into something with real narrative meaning. As Final Fantasy XIV continued to grow and expand in scope, its themes did so as well. What started as commentary on colonialism and imperialism, as seen in A Realm Reborn, quickly evolved into Heavensward's meditations on revenge and forgiveness, Stormblood's commentary on nationalism, cultural identity, and resistance, Shadowbringer's claims that life is inherently valuable and that it is vital that we move forward, and Endwalker's musings on how we proceed in the face of nihilism and tragedy. Each of these expansions has something meaningful to say, something that can easily be applied to the player's own life. Each expansion also increases in scope in a literal sense, going from what is essentially a territorial dispute in A Realm Reborn to facing the literal incarnation of nihilism in Endwalker. As powerful as I find some of these expansions to be, especially Shadowbringers, which is admittedly about the coldest take there is, they can only account for half of the game. And the other half? The community. Final Fantasy XIV is, of course, a massively multiplayer game, and it certainly earns the massive part of that title. It has tens of millions of total players, a frankly mind-boggling number. Back when Endwalker launched in December 2021, I vividly remember waiting for hours on end to log in. On launch day, for example, I entered the queue, went to my job, worked a full 8-hour shift, and then came back to see that I was still in the queue. The reach this game has really cannot be overstated, and that's evident in-game too. It's evident in the way players interact with each other, in high-end raids, in free companies, in impromptu limsa-limits of flash mobs. Art does not, arguably cannot, exist in isolation. It lives in connection, thrives on the interactions people have with each other in proximity to it, and Final Fantasy XIV is a connection engine, more so than other multiplayer games like Call of Duty. It is a world where meaning is constantly defined and redefined by developers and players alike. It is a realm reborn each time a player logs in, and that, to me, makes Final Fantasy XIV art. Video games are the youngest art form we have. As such, they're prone to error. They're messy, they crash and are patched back together, they are built and rebuilt, but in the midst of this mess lies something miraculous, because games can do what no other medium can. They let you move through a poem, touch a sculpture, inhabit a dream. They make you complicit in the story they're telling. Not every game is art. Most aren't. And that's okay. It's good, even, because when you stumble across one that is, you know it instantly and definitively. You carry it with you. You think about it on the drive to work, or in the shower, or years later when you hear a song that reminds you of it. It becomes part of your internal landscape. So I think the best way I can answer the question this video poses is this. Somewhere between the screen and the player, between the hands that made the game and the hands that hold it, there sometimes exists a fleeting moment of understanding. And that moment? That's the art.